Sarah Mitchell couldn't believe her eyes when she saw the $50 cabin listing and thought it was a scam, so she didn't pay much attention to it. However, at the real estate office in Cedar Falls, a small forest town in Oregon, when she saw the three little children sitting on chairs in their tattered clothes and the crumpled $27 in her pocket, she knew she had to take a chance, even if it was a scam, because if he didn't take that chance, they would probably freeze to death outside, so this cabin was their only hope. What he didn't know was that deep in the wilds of the Pacific Northwest, something older than the giant Douglas fir trees had been waiting for decades for the right person to claim this forgotten property. You are about to hear a story that will shock you and make you say it's impossible. What makes this story even more mysterious is that every word is documented fact. Police reports exist. Forest Service files are completely real. Newspaper clippings from 1987 tell a story most people would rather forget. Before I tell you this incredible story, I want you to think about and imagine something. Imagine yourself completely alone, penniless, homeless, with only 3 tiny children who depend on you. Now, imagine that the cabin, your only chance of survival, is located 25 miles away from the city, in a property so remote and frightening that its previous owners abandoned it in the middle of the night and disappeared into the darkness. Sarah, unfortunately, lived this life that everyone would shy away from to the core. By the end of the story, you will understand why Sarah never wanted to leave that cursed forest again. Sarah Mitchell was 32 years old when her world collapsed in the autumn of 1987. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, a fact that had earned her cruel nicknames throughout her childhood in small-town Washington. But her height was the least of her problems now. Her husband Robert had been killed 6 months earlier in a logging accident, crushed by a massive cedar when a cable snapped during a harvest operation. The logging company had paid out a settlement that barely covered the funeral costs and outstanding medical bills from Robert's previous injuries. Now she was alone with 10-year-old Michael, 8-year-old Emma, and 5-year-old little Bobby, named after his father. They'd been evicted from their company housing in Forks, Washington, and had been sleeping in their rusted-out Ford pickup truck for 3 weeks, moving between truck stops and rest areas, trying to stay ahead of social services who wanted to split up the family. Sarah had exactly $27 left from selling everything they owned. She'd already sold Robert's tools, her wedding ring, even the children's bicycles. The kids were down to 1 set of clothes each, and winter in the Pacific Northwest was coming fast. She could see it in the way the morning mist clung longer to the valleys, in the way the evergreens seemed to lean closer together as if bracing for the cold months ahead. That's when she saw the ad in the Cedar Falls Weekly Tribune, stuck between notices for firewood sales and church potlucks. Wilderness cabin for sale, 160 acres, $50 cash, serious inquiries only. Contact Hartley Real Estate, $50. Sarah read the ad 3 times, certain there had to be a catch. Nobody sold 160 acres of Pacific Northwest timberland for $50. But desperation, that makes people attempt impossible things, and Sarah Mitchell was beyond desperate. The Hartley Real Estate office was a converted gas station on the main drag of Cedar Falls, a logging town that had seen better decades. The proprietor, Jim Hartley, was a weathered man in his 60s with the kind of deep wrinkles that came from spending too many years outdoors in harsh weather. When Sarah walked in with her 3 children, Hartley looked up from his coffee and newspaper with the expression of a man who had seen too many desperate families over the years. "You're here about the wilderness property," Hartley said before Sarah could speak. It wasn't a question. "The $50 cabin." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who couldn't afford to offend anyone who might help her. Hartley studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn clothes, her children's thin faces, the way she held herself with a dignity that poverty couldn't quite erase. "Ma'am, I've got to ask, are you aware of the circumstances surrounding that property?" Sarah felt her heart sink. Here was the catch she'd been expecting. "What circumstances?" "Well," Hartley said, glancing at the children and lowering his voice, "the last family that lived there, the Caldwells, they left in quite a hurry back in '85. Middle of the night, left most of their belongings behind. Before them, the property had 3 other owners in 5 years. None of them lasted more than a few months." "Why?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Hartley shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Various reasons. The Jennings family claimed they heard things in the woods at night. The Kowalskis said something was killing their livestock. The Caldwells," he paused, "well, they told some stories that most folks around here prefer not to repeat." "What kind of stories?" "The kind that sound crazy when you tell them to normal people," Hartley said carefully. "Look, Mrs. Mitchell, I can see you're in a tight spot, and I respect that, but this property, it's 25 miles into the national forest. No electricity, no phone lines, no road access for the last 8 miles. You'd be completely cut off from civilization, and that's assuming you could handle whatever it was that drove off her families before you." Sarah looked at her children. Michael was trying to look brave, but she could see the fear in his 10-year-old eyes. Emma was holding Bobby's hand, whispering something reassuring to her little brother. They were all looking at her with the absolute trust that children place in their parents, the belief that somehow, some way, she would figure out how to keep them safe and fed and together. "Mr. Hartley," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her stomach, "I've got 3 kids, $27, and nowhere else to go. Whatever scared those other families away, it can't be worse than watching my children go hungry or get split up by the state." Hartley nodded slowly. He'd seen enough desperate people to recognize the particular brand of courage that comes from having no other options. "The property comes with a cabin, such as it is, a well that should still be functional, and an old logging road that gets you to within 8 miles. After that, it's hiking trail only. The deed is clear, previous owner died without heirs. State took possession, and they just want it off their books. I'll take it, Sarah said, pulling the crumpled bills from her purse. Mrs. Mitchell, I haven't even told you about the I'll take it, Sarah repeated, placing $27 on Hartley's desk. This is all I have, but I can work for the rest. I'll clean your office, do your filing, whatever you need. Hartley looked at the money, then at the tall woman standing before him with her chin raised in determination. Her children clustered around her like chicks around a hen. He'd been in the real estate business for 30 years, and he'd never seen anyone so clearly backed into a corner with no way out. Tell you what, he said finally, $27 will do, but I'm going to give you something else too. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a hunting rifle and a box of ammunition. This belonged to Tom Caldwell. He left it behind when he ran. Figure you might need it more than the state does. Sarah stared at the rifle. What exactly am I going to need to shoot, Mr. Hartley? Probably nothing, he said, but his eyes said otherwise. Bears, maybe. Cougars. The woods can be dangerous for folks who don't know what they're doing. The drive to the trailhead took 2 hours on increasingly rough roads. Hartley had insisted on driving them himself in his four-wheel drive truck, claiming he wanted to make sure they found the right trail. Sarah suspected he was having second thoughts about selling wilderness property to a woman with 3 small children, but it was too late for second thoughts now. The trailhead was nothing more than a rusted gate across what had once been a logging road. Beyond the gate, the road had been reclaimed by the forest. Massive Douglas firs and western hemlocks rose on both sides like the pillars of a cathedral, their tops lost in the perpetual mist that clung to the Olympic Peninsula. The silence was profound and unsettling after months of truck stop noise and highway sound. 8 miles that way, Hartley said, pointing down the overgrown road. You follow the old logging trail markers, the cabins in a clearing beside Whispering Creek. You can't miss it. It's the only structure for 20 miles in any direction. Sarah shouldered the largest pack while Michael and Emma took smaller ones. Bobby was still too young for a heavy pack, so he carried just his stuffed bear and a small bag of snacks. The rifle was strapped to Sarah's back, its weight a constant reminder of whatever dangers Hartley thought they might face. Mr. Hartley, Sarah said as they prepared to hike into the wilderness. What really happened to the Caldwell family? Hartley was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. Tom Caldwell came to my office at 3 in the morning, still in his pajamas, his wife and kids crying in the car outside. Said something had come out of the woods and tried to get into their cabin. Said it wasn't any kind of animal he'd ever seen. Said it was smart and angry and it wanted them gone. Did you believe him? I believed he was scared out of his mind, Hartley said. And Tom Caldwell wasn't a man who scared easily. He'd been a logger for 20 years, spent half his life in these woods. Whatever he saw that night, it was enough to make him abandon everything he owned and move his family to California. With that encouraging thought, Sarah Mitchell led her 3 children into the Olympic National Forest, following a trail that wound deeper and deeper into some of the most remote wilderness in the continental United States. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy in shafts of gold and green, and the only sounds were their footsteps on the soft forest floor and the distant call of ravens echoing through the trees. The hike was brutal. 8 miles might not sound like much, but 8 miles through overgrown forest trail with 3 tired, hungry children felt like 20. The old logging road was barely visible in places, overgrown with ferns and devil's club that grabbed at their clothes and packs. Massive fallen trees blocked the path every few hundred yards, forcing them to climb over or find ways around. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of decomposing wood and moss. Michael, despite being only 10, proved to be remarkably resilient. He helped Emma when she stumbled, carried Bobby's pack when the 5-year-old got tired, and never once complained about the distance or the difficulty of the terrain. Emma was struggling more, her 8-year-old legs not quite long enough for the terrain, but she pressed on with the determination she'd inherited from her mother. Bobby rode on Sarah's shoulders for the last 2 miles, adding his weight to the already substantial load she was carrying. It was nearly dark when they finally reached the clearing beside Whispering Creek. Sarah's first glimpse of their new home made her wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. The cabin was a one-room log structure with a stone chimney and a covered porch that sagged on one side. The logs were gray with age and weather, and several of the chinking stones had fallen out, leaving gaps that would let in wind and rain. The roof was metal, rusted red-brown and missing several sheets. One window was boarded up and the other was cracked but intact, but it was standing. It had 4 walls and a roof, and it was surrounded by 160 acres of forest that belonged to them now. After sleeping in a pickup truck for 3 weeks, even this primitive shelter looked like a mansion to Sarah's exhausted eyes. Is this really our house now, Mama? Bobby asked, his 5-year-old voice filled with wonder. Yes, baby, Sarah said, setting him down and surveying their new property. This is our home. The creek that gave the property its name ran clear and cold just 50 yards from the cabin, providing fresh water and a soothing constant murmur that seemed to welcome them to their new life. The clearing was large enough for a garden, and there were fruit trees, apples and pears that had gone wild, but still bore edible fruit. Sarah pushed open the cabin door, which groaned on rusted hinges. The interior was a single large room with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of abandoned furniture, and evidence that the Caldwell family had indeed left in a hurry. There were still canned goods on the shelves, clothes in a wooden chest, even toys scattered on the floor that had belonged to the Caldwell children. Why did they leave their toys? Emma asked, picking up a wooden horse that looked hand-carved. Sarah didn't have an answer for that. What could have been so terrifying that parents would flee in the night, leaving behind behind their children's beloved toys, as if in response to her thoughts. A sound echoed through the forest that made Sarah's blood run cold. It wasn't quite a howl, wasn't quite a roar. It was something in between, something that spoke of intelligence and anger and warning. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, bouncing off the trees and hills until it was impossible to tell where it had originated. The children moved closer to Sarah instinctively. Michael's face was pale in the fading light, and Bobby whimpered softly. Even Emma, usually the bravest of the three, pressed against her mother's side. "What was that, Mom?" Bobby whispered. "Just an animal, honey," Sarah said. But she was already reaching for the rifle Hartley had given her. "Probably a bear or an elk. We're in their territory now, so we need to be respectful and careful." The sound came again, closer this time, and definitely not from any bear or elk Sarah had ever heard. There was something almost human in the tone, as if whatever was making the noise was trying to communicate something specific. A warning, perhaps, or a challenge. Sarah quickly checked the rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. She'd grown up hunting with her father in the Cascade Mountains, so she knew her way around firearms, but she'd never had to use a gun to protect her children from something that might be more than just a wild animal. "Inside, kids," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "Let's get settled for the night." They brought their packs inside and lit the old kerosene lanterns they found on the shelves. The warm light pushed back the darkness and made the cabin feel less like an abandoned ruin and more like a potential home. Sarah checked the fireplace and found it functional, so she built a fire using wood that had been left by the previous occupants. As the fire crackled to life, filling the cabin with warmth and light, the children began to relax. They found sleeping bags left behind by the Caldwells and spread them out near the fireplace. Sarah opened cans of beans and corn for dinner, heated them over the fire, and for the first time in weeks, her children went to bed with full stomachs and warm, dry clothes. But Sarah didn't sleep. She sat in a chair facing the door, the rifle across her lap, listening to the sounds of the forest night. The creek burbled peacefully, and normal forest sounds filtered through the walls. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the creak of trees swaying in the wind. And then, around midnight, she heard footsteps, not the pad 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 of paws, but the deliberate crunch 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 of something walking upright through the fallen leaves around the cabin. The steps were slow, careful, as if whatever was making them was trying to be quiet but wasn't quite succeeding. They circled the cabin once, twice, 3 times, always staying just at the edge of the clearing where the firelight from the windows couldn't penetrate. Sarah's grip tightened on the rifle. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to wake the children and barricade the door, but she forced herself to remain still. Whatever was out there hadn't tried to get inside yet. Maybe it was just curious about the new occupants. Maybe if she didn't do anything threatening, it would satisfy its curiosity and leave. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the cabin's main window. Sarah could feel eyes watching her through the glass, studying her, evaluating her. The sensation of being observed was so intense it made her skin crawl, but she didn't move, didn't even turn to look directly at the window. She kept her eyes on the fire and waited. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps resumed. They moved around to the back of the cabin, paused at the boarded-up window, then moved to the door. The wooden porch creaked under a lot of weight, more than a man would make. Sarah held her breath as a door handle turned slowly. The door was latched from the inside, but the latch was old and probably wouldn't hold against determined pressure. The handle turned back and forth several times, testing, and then stopped. More footsteps on the porch, more creaking boards, then silence. Sarah waited until dawn before she dared to relax her grip on the rifle. When the first pale light began to filter through the trees, she finally allowed herself to check the windows. The clearing looked peaceful and normal in the early morning light. Birds were singing, and a family of deer had come down to drink from the creek. But when Sarah opened the door to get water for coffee, she found something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the Pacific Northwest wilderness. In the soft earth beside the porch steps were footprints, but they weren't the paws of a bear or the hooves of an elk. They were almost human, but elongated, with claw marks at the tips of what would have been toes. The prints were enormous, easily twice the size of Sarah's own feet, and they pressed deep into the soil, indicating something far heavier than any human. The prints circled the entire cabin, just as she'd heard during the night. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was that beside each footprint, pressed into the earth as clearly as if they'd been made in wet cement, were handprints, human-like handprints, but again far too large, with claw marks where fingernails should have been. Whatever had visited their cabin in the night walked upright like a human, but was definitely not human, and it had been close enough to touch the walls, close enough to peer through the windows at Sarah and her sleeping children. Sarah stared at the prints for a long time, the rifle still clutched in her hands. She thought about Tom Caldwell and his family, fleeing in the middle of the night. She thought about the other families who had tried to live here and failed. She thought about her children, still sleeping peacefully inside, trusting her to keep them safe. And then she thought about the $27 she'd spent on this property, every penny she had left in the world. They couldn't leave even if they wanted to. This was their home now, whether the forest's previous inhabitants approved or not. Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would change her family's life forever. Instead of packing up and hiking back to civilization, instead of admitting defeat and surrendering her children to social services, she was going to stay. She was going to figure out how to coexist with whatever was sharing these woods with them. Because sometimes, when you've lost everything else, the scariest place in the world world starts to look like the only place you belong. Sarah spent the next 3 days learning the rhythms of their new wilderness home while constantly watching for signs of their mysterious visitor. The creature, and she'd decided it was definitely a creature rather than just an unusually large person, hadn't returned since that first night, but Sarah could feel its presence in the forest like a weight pressing down on her consciousness. It was out there, watching, evaluating, deciding what to do about the new inhabitants of what it clearly considered its territory. The children adapted to their primitive living conditions with the resilience that only kids possess. Michael appointed himself the man of the house, helping Sarah repair the cabin's most urgent problems and taking seriously his role as protector of his younger siblings. Emma turned the abandoned toys into an elaborate fantasy world, creating stories about the previous children who had lived in the cabin and why they had to leave so suddenly. Bobby, at 5 years old, seemed to accept their new life as just another adventure, delighting in the creek, the wildlife, and the freedom to explore. But Sarah noticed things the children didn't. The way the forest would go completely silent for minutes at a time, as if every bird and small animal was holding its breath. The way their improvised clothesline would sometimes be disturbed in the morning, clothes arranged in patterns that didn't match how she'd hung them. The way Bobby would sometimes stop playing and stare intently at the tree line, as if he could see something moving in the shadows that adult eyes couldn't detect. On the fourth morning, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. She was collecting firewood at the edge of the clearing when she noticed that one of the apple trees had been systematically harvested, not by animals. The fruit had been carefully picked and placed in neat piles at the base of the tree. Someone or something had been gathering food, and doing it with more intelligence and organization than any wild animal possessed. Sarah examined the piles of apples more closely. They had been sorted by ripeness, with the greenest fruit in one pile, the ripest in another, and the ones that were starting to spoil set aside separately. It was the kind of methodical food preparation that spoke of planning and intelligence. As she studied the apple piles, Sarah heard a branch snap in the woods behind her. She spun around, her hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife on her belt, but saw nothing except the dense undergrowth of ferns and fallen logs that characterized the Pacific Northwest forest floor. "I know you're there," Sarah called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I can feel you watching us." Silence. Then, after a long moment, the sound of something large moving carefully through the forest, circling around her position. Not approaching but not retreating either. Maintaining distance while staying close enough to observe. Sarah made a decision that was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. She sat down on a fallen log beside the apple tree, making herself smaller and less threatening. "I'm not here to hurt you or take your territory," she said, speaking to the forest in general, since she couldn't see her observer. "My children and I, we don't have anywhere else to go. We'll share the land respectfully if you'll let us stay." The movement in the forest stopped. Sarah could feel attention focused on her like a physical weight, intelligent eyes evaluating her words and her body language. She remained sitting, hands visible and empty, projecting calm even though her heart was racing. After several minutes, she heard the sound of something being placed on the ground, followed by the careful retreat of footsteps moving away through the forest. When the sounds had faded completely, Sarah approached the spot where she'd heard the noise. On a flat stone, someone had left a large salmon, recently caught and expertly cleaned. Beside it was a pile of wild berries and what looked like edible roots, all arranged with the same careful organization as the apple pie. It was an offering, or perhaps a test. Sarah carefully gathered the food and carried it back to the cabin, where she found her children playing a complicated game involving the abandoned toys and elaborate rules they'd invented. The sight of their normal childhood activities contrasted sharply with the increasingly surreal situation she was trying to navigate. "Kids," Sarah called, setting the unexpected bounty on the cabin's wooden table. "Come look at what someone left for us." Michael was the first to examine the salmon and wild foods. At 10 years old, he'd spent enough time with his logger father to recognize quality wilderness survival skills when he saw them. "Mama, whoever cleaned this fish really knew what they were doing. Look how perfect the cuts are." Emma poked at the berry suspiciously. "Who would leave food for us? There's nobody else out here." "There's somebody," Bobby said matter-of-factly. "The big person. I seen him watching us from the trees." Sarah felt her blood chill. "Bobby? What big person? When did you see him?" "Every day," Bobby replied with 5-year-old certainty. "He's really tall, and he has funny hands, but he's not mean. He just watches to make sure we're okay." Sarah knelt down to Bobby's eye level. "Can you show me where you saw this person?" Bobby nodded and led her to the cabin's back window. "He stands over there by the big tree when you're doing your morning chores. He's careful not to scare the deer, but sometimes they see him and they're not scared either." Sarah looked where Bobby was pointing and saw the massive Douglas fir that dominated the back edge of their clearing. Its trunk was easily 8 feet in diameter, large enough to hide something substantial. "What does he look like?" "Baby, like a really big man, but with longer arms, and his face is different. And he's got hair all over, like the bears in my picture books, but he stands up straight like people do." Sarah's mouth went dry. Bobby was describing something that sounded suspiciously like the creatures from Pacific Northwest legends: Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever name you wanted to give to the mysterious beings that Native American tribes had been telling stories about for thousands of years. But Bobby wasn't scared. In fact, he seemed to regard their mysterious watcher as a benevolent presence, someone keeping an eye on them rather than stalking them with malicious intent. That evening, Sarah made another decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. She prepared dinner using the salmon and wild foods that had been left for them, seasoning the fish with herbs she found growing wild near the creek. The meal was better than anything they'd eaten since Robert's death, fresh and clean and somehow more satisfying than any store store-bought food. After the children were asleep, Sarah took a plate of the cooked salmon and placed it on the flat stone where she'd found the original offering. It seemed only polite to return the gesture. In the morning, the plate was empty and had been carefully washed in the creek. Beside it was another gift, a bundle of dry firewood, cut to perfect lengths for their fireplace and stacked with military precision. This became their routine. Sarah would find offerings of food, tools, or materials they needed. She would prepare meals using what had been provided and leave portions as thanks. The mysterious benefactor would accept the offerings and leave new gifts in return. Over the following weeks, their invisible neighbor provided them with winter supplies that would have cost hundreds of dollars in town if such items had even been available. Expertly tanned deer hides that Sarah could use to repair gaps in the cabin walls. Medicinal herbs that helped when Emma came down with a cold. Tools that had clearly been crafted by hand. Knives with bone handles. A bow that was perfectly balanced. Arrows with stone points that were sharper than anything modern manufacturing could produce. Michael was fascinated by the craftsmanship of the tools. "Mama, look at how these arrow points are made. Whoever's doing this knows more about living in the woods than anybody I ever met." Sarah was beginning to agree. Their mysterious neighbor wasn't just surviving in the wilderness, he was thriving. The gifts showed a level of skill and knowledge that spoke of decades, perhaps generations, of life in these mountains. But she still hadn't seen him clearly. Despite Bobby's daily reports of sightings, their benefactor was incredibly careful to avoid direct contact, appearing only when the family was inside the cabin or otherwise occupied. That changed on a gray November morning when Sarah heard Emma screaming. She rushed outside to find her 8-year-old daughter backed against the cabin wall, pointing in terror at something near the creek. Following Emma's gaze, Sarah saw what had frightened her. A massive bear, easily 7 feet tall when standing on its hind legs, was between Emma and the cabin. But this wasn't their mysterious benefactor. This was a predator, a hungry black bear that had been drawn by the scent of their food supplies and was now eyeing Emma as potential prey. Sarah grabbed the rifle from inside the cabin, but she was a good 50 yards from her daughter, with the bear blocking any direct path between them. If she fired and missed, or if the shot only wounded the animal, it might attack Emma before Sarah could reach her. The bear dropped to all fours and began moving toward Emma, who was frozen with terror against the cabin wall. Sarah raised the rifle, trying to get a clear shot that wouldn't risk hitting her daughter, but the angle was wrong, and Emma was directly in the line of fire. That's when their mysterious protector finally revealed himself. Something enormous erupted from the forest, behind the bear, not emerging carefully from hiding but crashing through the underbrush with the force of an avalanche. Sarah's first glimpse of their neighbor was a blur of dark fur, massive limbs, and focused violence as 8 feet of pure muscle slammed into the bear from behind. The two giants rolled across the clearing in a tangle of claws and fury, but the fight was over almost before it began. Their protector was larger, stronger, and fighting to defend territory and family rather than just seeking food. Within seconds, the bear was fleeing into the forest, bloodied and thoroughly intimidated by something even more formidable than itself. Sarah's savior stood in the center of the clearing, breathing heavily from the brief but intense fight. For the first time, she got a clear look at the being who had been watching over her family. He was everything Bobby had described and more. Nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair that was clearly groomed and maintained rather than matted like an animal's coat. His face was more human than ape, with intelligent brown eyes that held wisdom and sadness in equal measure. His hands were enormous but clearly capable of delicate work. These were the hands that had carved those perfect tools and arranged food with such careful precision. Most importantly, when he looked at Emma still pressed against the cabin wall but no longer screaming, his expression was one of gentle concern rather than any kind of threat. "Thank you," Sarah said, lowering the rifle and stepping slowly toward her daughter. "Thank you for protecting her." The creature, she could no longer think of him as just a creature, not after seeing that intelligence in his eyes, not at once. A distinctly human gesture that bridged the gap between their species more effectively than any words could have. Emma ran to Sarah and buried her face in her mother's jacket, but she was no longer terrified. The being who had just saved her life stood quietly in their clearing, making no aggressive moves, projecting calm the way some people naturally project charisma. "You've been taking care of us," Sarah continued, keeping her voice soft and non-threatening. "All those gifts, the food, the tools, you've been making sure we survive our first winter here." Another nod. Michael and Bobby had emerged from the cabin and were staring in awe at their protector. Neither boy showed any fear, only fascination and gratitude. "Can you understand what I'm saying?" Sarah asked. The third nod, more definitive this time. "We don't want to take your territory away from you," Sarah said. "We want to share it if that's possible. We'll respect the forest and take only what we need." The being studied her for a long moment, then moved to the edge of the clearing where a massive cedar tree dominated the forest canopy. He placed one enormous hand on the trunk and looked back at Sarah expectantly. Sarah approached carefully, understanding instinctively that this was some kind of ceremony or formal agreement. When she reached the tree, she placed her own much smaller hand beside his on the ancient bark. The moment her palm touched the cedar, Sarah felt something she couldn't quite describe, a sense of connection not just to the tree, but to the entire forest, as if the tree was somehow a conduit to the living network of root and branch and wildlife that made up the ecosystem around them. For just a moment, she could sense the health of the woods, the water table beneath their feet, the migration patterns of the animals that shared this space. When she removed her hand, the sensation faded, but the memory of that connection remained. She looked up at her protector and saw approval in his ancient eyes. He made a gesture toward the cabin, then toward the forest, then brought his hands together in what was unmistakably a sign of unity or partnership. The message was clear. They could share this space, but only if they understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. "I understand," Sarah said. "We're grateful for your protection and will honor our agreement." Their protector stepped back and began to fade into the forest with the same careful stealth he'd used to remain hidden for weeks. But before he disappeared completely, he did something that surprised Sarah. He waved goodbye to Bobby. It was such a casual human gesture that Sarah almost laughed. This ancient guardian of the wilderness, this being of legend and mystery, had taken the time to acknowledge her 5-year-old son's daily friendship. "Bye," Bobby called cheerfully, waving back. "Thanks for saving Emma." And then their protector was gone, vanishing into the deep woods as if he'd never been there at all. That night, as Sarah tucked her children into their sleeping bags near the fireplace, Emma asked the question that had been on all their minds. "Mama, what was that? What kind of animal stands up like a person and saves people from bears?" Sarah considered how to answer. She could give Emma the scientific explanation, talk about undiscovered species and evolutionary mysteries. She could reference the Native American legends about forest guardians and wild men of the woods, or she could tell her daughter the simple truth as she understood it. "I think," Sarah said finally, "that was someone who's been living in these woods for a very long time. Someone who knows that families need protection, especially when they're far from civilization, like a forest guardian angel." Bobby asked sleepily. Sarah smiled and kissed his forehead. "Something like that, baby, something like that." Outside, the November wind whistled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a sound echoed through the forest. Not quite a howl, not quite a call. It was the sound of someone letting his territory know that all was well, that the family under his protection was safe for another night. Winter in the Olympic National Forest came early that year, and it came hard. By December, snow lay 3 feet deep around the cabin, and the temperature rarely climbed above freezing even during the day. Sarah had been terrified about how they would survive their first winter in such a remote location, but their guardian had been preparing for months. Throughout the autumn, their mysterious protector had steadily supplied them with everything they needed. Firewood appeared in perfectly organized stacks beside the cabin. Their root cellar, which Sarah hadn't even known existed until she found it carefully stocked, was filled with preserved fish, dried berries, nuts, and root vegetables that could last them through the coldest months. Warm furs and hides had been left folded on their porch, thick enough to serve as additional blankets and winter clothing. Most remarkably, their guardian had somehow winterized the cabin itself. Sarah woke one morning to discover that every gap in the log walls had been carefully chinked with a mixture of mud, moss, and pine needles that created an airtight seal. The damaged sections of the roof had been repaired with cedar shakes that fit so perfectly they might have been installed by professional carpenters. Even the cabin's single cracked window had been reinforced with a transparent film that Sarah eventually realized was animal membrane, stretched thin and treated until it was nearly as clear as glass. Mama, Michael said one snowy morning as they ate breakfast by the fire, "I think our friend knows more about building than anyone in town. Look at how perfect this chinking is. It's better than what the logging company did on their crew houses." Sarah had to agree. Every repair showed a level of skill and knowledge that spoke of generations of experience living in harmony with the forest. Their guardian wasn't just surviving in the wilderness, he was thriving, using techniques and materials that modern civilization had forgotten. But it wasn't just the practical support that amazed Sarah, it was the thoughtfulness behind every gift. When Emma had admired a particular type of wildflower, pressed specimens appeared on their doorstep the next morning, perfectly preserved and arranged. When Bobby had mentioned missing his picture books, hand-carved wooden toys began appearing, animals and figures that told stories without words, each one crafted with incredible attention to detail. The children had adapted to their guardian's presence with the remarkable flexibility of youth. Bobby continued his daily ritual of waving to their protector and providing running commentary about their mysterious neighbors' activities. "He's checking the trail markers today, Mama, making sure nobody bad can find us." Or he brought new herbs for Emma's tea, the ones that make her cough better. Emma had overcome her initial fear completely. She'd taken to leaving small drawings and notes for their guardian, tucking them under the stone where they exchanged gifts. The drawings always disappeared, and sometimes Emma would find small tokens in return, pretty stones, interesting seed pods, or feathers from rare birds that normally avoided human contact. Michael had become fascinated with the craftsmanship of their guardian's tools, and had begun experimenting with his own woodworking projects. Their protector had noticed Michael's interest and began leaving instructional materials, pieces of wood carved to show different joinery techniques, or examples of how to work with the grain rather than against it. "I think he's teaching me," Michael told Sarah one evening as he worked on carving a wooden spoon. "Every time I try something new, the next day there's an example of how to do it better. It's like having a teacher who never has to say anything out loud." But it was Bobby who made the breakthrough that changed their relationship from cautious cooperation to something approaching friendship. On a particularly snowy morning in January, 5-year-old Bobby Bobby announced his intention to build a snowman. Sarah helped him roll the traditional three-part construction in their clearing, using charcoal for the eyes and a carrot from their root cellar for the nose. It was a perfectly ordinary snowman by any objective measure, but Bobby was enormously proud of his creation. The next morning, the snowman had been joined by a companion, but this wasn't a snowman built by human hands. This was a massive snow sculpture that stood nearly 10 feet tall, expertly crafted to resemble their guardian. Every detail was perfect: the broad shoulders, the intelligent eyes, even the careful way he held his hands to show that he meant no harm. Bobby was delighted. He made a snowman too. "Mama, now mine won't be lonely." But Sarah was amazed by something else entirely. The snow sculpture wasn't just artistically impressive, it was anatomically accurate. Their guardian had essentially provided them with a detailed cell, showing them exactly what he looked like without the shadows and distance that had characterized their previous encounters. She could see now that he was definitely more human than ape. Despite his size and hair covering, his facial structure was human, just larger and more robust. His hands, while massive, had fully opposable thumbs and showed the calluses and scars that came from a lifetime of skilled craftwork. This wasn't some primitive beast. This was a being with intelligence, culture, and artistic sensibility. He wants us to understand him, Sarah realized aloud. This sculpture, it's his way of introducing himself properly. Emma studied the snow figure carefully. He looks kind, Mama, not scary at all when you can see his whole face. That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She bundled up in her warmest clothes and walked to the edge of the clearing, where she knew their guardian often stood to observe them. Instead of calling out to the forest in general, she spoke directly to the massive Douglas fir where she was certain he was watching from. "I know you can hear me," she said clearly. "I want to thank you properly for everything you've done for my family. We wouldn't have survived this winter without your help." Silence from the forest, but Sarah could feel attention focused on her words. "I also want you to know that you're welcome to visit us more openly if you'd like. The children would love to meet you properly. They're not afraid anymore, and neither am I." She waited, but there was no immediate response. Sarah was turning to go back inside when she heard a sound behind her. She turned to see their guardian emerging from behind the great tree, moving slowly and carefully, his massive hands held open where she could see them. Up close, he was even more impressive than the snow sculpture had suggested. His dark brown hair was clearly maintained, braided in some places and decorated with small carved ornaments. His clothing was sophisticated, not just random animal hides, but carefully tailored garments that showed both practical function and aesthetic consideration. But what struck Sarah most forcefully was his expression. He looked nervous, almost shy, like someone meeting new neighbors for the first time and hoping to make a good impression. "Hello," Sarah said simply. "Thank you for protecting my family." Their guardian nodded and then did something completely unexpected. He reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object, which he offered to Sarah with obvious ceremony. It was a carved wooden pendant about the size of Sarah's palm, depicting a family of 4 humans standing beneath a large tree with a protective figure watching over them from the branches above. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, with every detail rendered in perfect miniature. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, accepting the gift with appropriate reverence. "Is this how you see us, as your family to protect?" Another nod, more definitive this time. Sarah studied the carving more closely and realized that the human figures weren't generic. They were recognizable portraits of herself and her 3 children, carved with such accuracy that she could distinguish Michael from Bobby, despite the tiny scale. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked, wondering why. Her guardian held up fingers on both hands, then repeated the gesture several times. Sarah counted carefully and realized he was indicating months he'd been observing them and planning this formal introduction since they'd first arrived. "You wanted to make sure we were really going to stay before you revealed yourself completely." Sarah understood. "You've been hurt before by humans who left." The pain that flickered across his intelligent features confirmed her guess. Other families had come and gone, promising to respect the forest and then fleeing when they discovered they weren't alone in the wilderness. He'd been protecting the land for decades, watching family after family abandon it when faced with his presence. But Sarah and her children had stayed. They'd accepted his gifts, honored their agreements, and treated his territory with respect. They'd proven themselves worthy of trust. "We're not leaving," Sarah said firmly. "This is our home now, just like it's your home. We want to share it with you properly." That evening, their guardian joined them for dinner for the first time. It was awkward initially. He had to crouch to fit through their doorway, and his massive frame made their cabin feel tiny, but the children's natural enthusiasm soon broke through any remaining barriers. Bobby immediately appointed himself as tour guide, showing off their guardian's own gifts as if they were family heirlooms. "This is the knife you made for Mama, and these are the toys you made for me, and this is the bow you made for Michael." Emma shyly offered to share her drawings, spreading them out on the table for their guests' inspection. Their guardian examined each one carefully, commenting with gestures and expressions that clearly indicated appreciation for her artistic efforts. Michael peppered their visitor with questions about woodworking techniques, tool maintenance, and forest survival skills. Their guardian patiently demonstrated different carving grips and showed Michael how to read the grain of different types of wood. As the evening progressed, Sarah realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. This being, who had lived in solitude for decades, was clearly starved for companionship and family interaction. He watched her children with the devoted attention of a grandfather, delighting in their personalities and achievements. When it came time for bed, their guardian prepared to leave, but Bobby had other ideas. "Can't you stay here tonight? We have lots of blankets and it's really cold outside." Their protector looked questioningly at Sarah, clearly wanting to accept but uncertain about overstepping boundaries. "You're welcome to stay," Sarah said. "Your family now." That night, for the first time in months, Sarah slept deeply without worrying about their safety. Their guardian positioned himself near the door, not sleeping but maintaining a quiet watch that allowed the rest of the family to rest completely. When Sarah woke in the morning, she found her children clustered around their massive houseguest, listening intently as he demonstrated how to weave baskets from pine needles. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that she had to remind herself that most families didn't have 9-foot-tall forest guardians as permanent houseguests, but this was their normal now. This was their family. Over the following weeks, their guardian became a regular presence in their daily lives. He would appear each morning to help with chores, teaching the children advanced wilderness skills while Sarah worked on expanding their garden plans for spring. He showed Michael how to track animals, taught Emma which plants were edible and which were dangerous, and patiently answered Bobby's endless questions about forest life. Most importantly, he provided the children with something Sarah had worried they would never have again: a father figure, not a replacement for Robert, but a new kind of protector who understood their unique circumstances and could teach them skills no ordinary parent possessed. "Mama," Emma said one evening as they prepared dinner together, "I think we're the luckiest family in the world." "Why is that, sweetheart?" "Because we have the best guardian angel ever, and he chose us to be his family too." Sarah looked across the cabin at their protector, who was helping Bobby and Michael work on a complicated puzzle carved from a single piece of wood. The sight of this legendary being, this creature of myth and wilderness lore, patiently entertaining her children while they giggled at his gentle humor, filled her with a happiness she'd thought she'd lost forever when Robert died. Their guardian looked up and caught her watching them. He smiled, an expression that transformed his massive features from intimidating to genuinely warm, and gestured toward the children with obvious pride. Yes, Sarah thought, Emma was absolutely right. They were definitely the luckiest family in the world. Outside, the winter storm continued to rage, but inside their cabin, 5 members of the most unusual family in the Pacific Northwest were safe, warm, and content. The widow who had bought a cabin for $50 had gained something worth more than any amount of money: a protector, a teacher, and a friend who would watch over them for the rest of their lives. 2 years had passed since the research team incident, and the Mitchell family had become something that anthropologists would have considered impossible: modern humans who had successfully integrated into a primeval ecosystem without losing their essential humanity. They moved through their forest home with the confidence of apex predators while maintaining the gentle wisdom that their guardian had spent decades nurturing, but their transformation had not gone completely unnoticed by the outside world. The first sign of trouble came through Bobby, whose connection with forest wildlife had developed into something approaching telepathy. The 6-year-old came running to the cabin one morning with news that chilled Sarah's blood. "Mama, the ravens say there are bad men coming. Not like the scientist people. Really bad men with loud machines and mean hearts." Their guardian emerged from the workshop he'd built behind the cabin, where he'd been crafting winter supplies. His expression was grim as he confirmed Bobby's intelligence through his own network of animal contacts. Something was approaching, their territory that posed a threat unlike anything they'd faced before. Sarah gathered the family around their planning table, a massive cross-section of ancient cedar that their guardian, who had carved with detailed topographical maps of their expanded territory. Using his sophisticated system of symbols and drawings, he explained what was approaching: a logging operation. Not the sustainable, selective harvesting that responsible forestry companies practiced, but a clear-cutting operation designed to strip entire sections of old-growth forests as quickly and cheaply as possible. The company had purchased logging rights to several thousand acres that included the outer boundaries of their sanctuary, but this wasn't just a threat to their privacy and security. This was an assault on the living ecosystem that their guardian had spent decades protecting, and that they had sworn to safeguard for future generations. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked, studying the symbols their guardian drew to indicate the largest timeline. The answer was sobering. The advance crews would arrive within a month to begin surveying and marking trees. The heavy equipment would follow within 6 weeks. Once the cutting began, centuries of forest growth would be destroyed in a matter of weeks. Michael, now 12 years old and wise beyond his years in the ways of the wilderness, asked the question they were all thinking: can we stop them legally? Sarah had been wondering the same thing. The property they lived on was theirs, purchased legally even if but their expanded sanctuary extended far beyond their original 160 acres, encompassing forest land that technically belonged to the state and could be sold to logging companies under existing regulations. Their guardian shook his head sadly. He'd watched this pattern repeat itself throughout his long lifetime: forests that had stood for millennia destroyed by humans who saw only immediate profit rather than long-term stewardship. Legal challenges might delay the inevitable, but they rarely stopped it entirely. But Sarah had been thinking like a wilderness strategist for 2 years now, and she had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. What if they can't find the trees they want to cut? Her guardian tilted his massive head, not understanding her meaning. Sarah spread her hands over the topographical map, indicating the sections that were scheduled for clear cutting. "You've taught us to make ourselves invisible when we need to disappear. Can we make trees invisible too?" The concept was audacious beyond anything their guardian had ever attempted. Sarah was proposing that they use their knowledge of forest ecosystems to camouflage and protect entire groves of ancient trees, making them appear worthless to commercial logging operations while preserving their ecological function. Michael caught on immediately. "Like how you made those fake archaeological sites to confuse the researchers. But instead of creating false attractions, illusions. We create false boundaries. Exactly, Sarah said, warming to the idea. We alter the visual landscape to make the most valuable timber appear to be in areas where it's economically impractical to harvest, while making the less critical areas appear more attractive to commercial operations. Emmett, now 10 years old and deeply versed in plant biology, added her own insight. We could use controlled plant growth to change how the forest boundaries look from ground level and aerial surveys, make the good trees look like they're in swampy or unstable ground. Even Bobby contributed, suggesting that his animal friends that could help by concentrating in certain areas to make them seem like critical wildlife habitats that might be protected by environmental regulations. Their guardian considered the proposal for a long time, walking the boundaries of their territory and examining the terrain with eyes that had been studying forest systems for decades. When he returned to the cabin 3 days later, he had developed a comprehensive strategy that was more sophisticated than anything Sarah had imagined. The plan required them to essentially redraw the forest from a logging company's perspective, using every trick of terrain modification, plant manipulation, and wildlife management they had learned. It would be the largest and most complex camouflage operation ever attempted, requiring months of intensive work and perfect coordination between human intelligence and natural systems. First, they needed to alter the access routes that logging trucks would use to reach the most valuable groves. Their guardian showed them how to trigger controlled landslides and fallen tree blockages that would make certain roads impassable, while leaving alternative routes that led to less critical areas. Second, they would manipulate the forest canopy using selective pruning and strategic plant growth to make aerial surveys misidentify the locations of the largest and oldest trees. From above, the most valuable timber would appear to be scattered and difficult to harvest efficiently. Third, they would create false environmental hazards that would discourage development in critical areas, artificial bar conditions, signs of unstable soil, and concentrated wildlife activity that would trigger environmental protection protocols. The work began immediately and required every skill they had developed over the past 2 years. Sarah found herself coordinating an operation that involved redirecting streams, transplanting entire groves of vegetation, and timing natural processes with the precision of a military campaign. Michael used his tracking and navigation abilities to map every possible access route the logging crews might use, then worked with their guardian to eliminate or redirect the most problematic paths. They triggered rock slides that appeared completely natural but effectively blocked key roads. They encouraged beaver populations to dam streams in locations that would flood critical logging sites. Emma applied her knowledge of plant biology to create rapid growth conditions that would camouflage valuable trees and make less important areas appear more commercially attractive. She worked with moss, lichen, and climbing plants to alter the visual characteristics of tree trunks, making ancient cedars appear diseased or damaged while highlighting younger, less critical timber. Bobby served as their communication coordinator, using his connection with wildlife to maintain a remote intelligence network that tracked the approaching logging crews and reported on their activities. Ravens brought daily updates on the surveyors' progress, while deer and elk were positioned to create apparent wildlife corridors that would complicate environmental impact assessments. The scale of the operation was staggering. They were essentially conducting ecological engineering across thousands of acres, making changes that appeared completely natural but would fundamentally alter how commercial interests perceive the forest's value. As the advanced logging crews arrived and began their preliminary surveys, Sarah watched through concealed observation posts as their strategy played out. The surveyors found access routes blocked by apparently recent landslides. Their aerial photographs showed timber distributions that didn't match their preliminary assessments. Environmental surveys revealed wildlife concentrations and soil conditions that would require expensive mitigation measures. Most importantly, the areas that contained the oldest and most ecologically valuable trees appeared to be scattered, difficult to access, and economically problematic to harvest, while areas with younger, more replaceable timber seemed easily accessible and environmentally uncomplicated. The logging company's revised assessment concluded that the purchased acreage was marginally profitable at best and would require infrastructure investments that weren't justified by the available timber quality. Within 6 weeks of beginning their survey, they sold their logging rights to a smaller company that specialized in selective harvesting rather than clear-cutting operations. Sarah watched the bulldozers and logging trucks disappear down the mountain roads with a sense of triumph that was tempered by exhaustion. They had saved their forest home, but the effort had required them to push their abilities and knowledge to the absolute limit. That evening, as the family gathered around their fire to celebrate their victory, their guardian made an announcement that surprised everyone. Using his elaborate system of drawings and gestures, he explained that their success had proven something he had hoped for but never dared to expect. They were no longer just his protected family. They had become his equals as guardians of the forest. The knowledge he had spent decades accumulating, the wisdom of his people that he had thought would die with him, had been successfully passed on to a new generation. Sarah and her children had proven they could use that knowledge not just for survival, but for active protection of the wilderness ecosystem. You're saying we're ready to be guardians ourselves, Sarah realized. Not just students, but teachers and protectors in our own right. Their guardian nodded and added something that took Sarah's breath away. He drew symbols indicating other forests, other threatened wilderness areas, other places that needed the kind of protection they had just provided. Their success here was just the beginning. They had developed skills and knowledge knowledge that could be used to protect wilderness areas throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond. You want us to expand our territory, Michael said, understanding the implications immediately, not just defending this forest, but helping to defend others. The vision their guardian outlined was breathtaking in its scope. A network of guardian families, trained in the deep wilderness wisdom he had preserved, working to protect critical ecosystems from commercial destruction and human encroachment. They would be modern-day druids, bridge builders between ancient knowledge and contemporary environmental needs. But the most remarkable part of his proposal was that they wouldn't be working alone. Through his animal communication networks, their guardian had been in contact with other survivors of his people, solitary beings who had been protecting isolated pockets of wilderness throughout the region. With the proven success of their integrated family model, these guardians were willing to emerge from hiding and begin training human families of their own. "There are others like you?" Emma asked with wonder. Their guardian's expression showed both sadness and hope as he explained. There were others, but very few. His people had been driven to the edge of extinction by human expansion, leaving perhaps a dozen individuals scattered across the vast wilderness areas of North America. But those survivors possessed knowledge and abilities that were absolutely crucial for environmental protection in an era of accelerating climate change and habitat destruction. The proposal he was making would change everything about their lives. Instead of remaining hidden in their forest sanctuary, they would become active participants in a larger movement to preserve wilderness areas across the continent. They would train other families, establish protected territories, and work to create a network of guardians who could respond to environmental threats wherever they emerged. It was dangerous work. It would put them in conflict with powerful economic interests and expose them to risks they had successfully avoided for years. But it was also the natural evolution of everything they had learned and accomplished. Sarah looked at her children, trying to imagine them as adults leading their own guardian families and protecting their own territories. Michael would become a master tactician, capable of organizing defense operations across entire mountain ranges. Emma would be a healer and plant specialist, able to restore damaged ecosystems and train others in sustainable resource management. Even Bobby would grow up with abilities that no other human possessed, serving as a bridge between human communities and the animal world. "What do you kids think?" Sarah asked. "This would mean leaving our home here eventually, traveling to help establish other protected areas. It would be dangerous, and we'd be taking on responsibilities that most people couldn't even imagine." "I want to help save other forests," Emma said immediately. "This place taught me how beautiful the wilderness can be when it's protected. Other places deserve the same protection." "I want to meet the other guardians," Michael added. "I want to learn everything they can teach us and help train new families." Bobby's contribution was typically succinct. "Adventure." Sarah took a deep breath and looked at their guardian, this being who had saved them, trained them, and now offered them the chance to become something unprecedented in modern times. "All right," she said, "let's save the world." The decision launched them into a new phase of their lives that was more challenging and rewarding than anything they had experienced. Over the following months, they began making contact with other guardian families, sharing knowledge and coordinating protection efforts across multiple wilderness areas. Sarah discovered that her strategic thinking abilities and leadership skills made her a natural coordinator for the growing network. She became the human face of a movement that worked behind the scenes to protect critical ecosystems from destruction, while training a new generation of environmentalists who understood wilderness protection at the deepest possible level. Their original forest sanctuary became the headquarters for this new conservation network, but it was no longer their permanent home. They traveled throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond, establishing protection protocols and training families who would carry on the work of wilderness guardianship. The widow who had bought a cabin for $50 had become something she'd never dreamed of, the leader of a secret environmental protection network that combined ancient wisdom with modern conservation needs. Her children were growing up as the first generation of human beings trained to think like forests, to plan like ecosystems, and to protect wilderness areas with skills their guardian ancestors would have recognized and approved. 10 years had passed since the research team incident, and the Guardian Network had grown into a global movement that combined ancient ecological wisdom with modern conservation science. Guardian families had established protected territories on every continent, working with indigenous communities, environmental organizations, and governments to create a new model of human nature. Partnership. Sarah's children had become leaders of this expanding movement, training new generations of guardians while advancing the scientific understanding of forest ecosystems and wildlife protection. Michael had established the first university program in applied ecosystem guardianship, teaching traditional conservation biology alongside the deep ecological wisdom he had learned in the forests. Emma had founded a global network of botanical preserves that protected rare plant species while advancing the development of natural medicines. Bobby had become an international ambassador for wildlife protection, using his unique abilities to establish communication protocols between human communities and animal populations. But perhaps the most important legacy of their work was the change it brought to human understanding of wilderness protection. The Guardian model demonstrated that environmental conservation wasn't just about preserving scenic areas for human enjoyment, but about maintaining maintaining the complex ecological relationships that sustained all life on the planet. The operation they were planning today would be their most challenging yet. A consortium of development companies, backed by international investment capital, was proposing the largest wilderness development project in Pacific Northwest history. They wanted to build a luxury resort complex that would destroy over 50,000 acres of old-growth forest and displace wildlife populations that had thrived in the region for millennia. Development had cleared all legal hurdles. Environmental impact studies had been manipulated or circumvented through political influence and regulatory capture. Traditional conservation organizations lacked the resources and legal standing to mount effective opposition. Within 6 months, bulldozers would begin clearing some of the most ecologically valuable forests remaining in North America. But the developers had no idea they were about to face opposition from protectors who thought and acted like forces of nature itself. The primary challenge, Michael explained to the assembled Guardian families, is the scale of the operation. This isn't a single logging crew we can redirect or confuse. This is a coordinated development involving hundreds of vehicles, thousands of workers, and enough political backing to override most conventional opposition. Sarah studied the topographical maps spread across their planning table, each one marked with symbols indicating forest guardian positions, wildlife corridors, and critical ecosystem boundaries. The developers' plans would cut through the heart of a forest network that their Guardian families had spent years establishing and protecting. We can't use the same tactics that worked against smaller threats, she said. This requires something unprecedented. We need to coordinate natural systems across multiple states simultaneously. Emma leaned over the maps, tracing watershed boundaries with her finger. What if we use the forest itself to protest, not just hiding or redirecting the development, but making the entire ecosystem actively resist the intrusion? Their original Guardian nodded approvingly. Emma was thinking like her ancient predecessors, understanding that human purposes and natural systems could be aligned when guided by sufficient knowledge and wisdom. Over the following weeks, the Guardian Network implemented a strategy that was part environmental science, part guerrilla theater, and part something that most people would have called magic. They began by accelerating natural processes that would make the development sites ecologically unsuitable for construction. Sarah coordinated the overall strategy while Michael managed tactical implementation across the 7-state region. They triggered controlled avalanches that blocked access roads with what appeared to be natural seasonal events. They redirected water tables to create wetland conditions in areas that developers had planned to build upon. They encouraged accelerated plant growth that transformed construction sites into apparent wildlife habitats protected by environmental regulations. But most importantly, they coordinated the wildlife populations across the entire region to demonstrate the area's critical ecological significance in ways that even politically compromised environmental agencies couldn't ignore. Thousands of animals began migrating into the development zones, not in random patterns but in coordinated movements that created the largest wildlife concentration in recorded Pacific Northwest history. Endangered species that hadn't been seen in the region for decades suddenly appeared in numbers that suggested thriving but previously hidden populations. The spectacle attracted national media attention within days. Environmental photographers captured images of elk herds, bear families, and wolf packs coexisting peacefully in areas that the development consortium had claimed were ecologically barren. Bird species that were thought to be extinct in the region appeared in massive flocks that darkened the skies above the proposed construction sites. It's like the forest is defending itself, reported a CNN correspondent who had come to cover what the media dubbed the Great Wildlife Gathering. Every day brings new species, new populations that scientists didn't know existed in these mountains. The developer consortium found itself facing a public relations nightmare. Their environmental impact studies, which had dismissed the area as having minimal wildlife value, were revealed to be either fraudulent or incompetent. Environmental groups that had been powerless to stop the development through legal channels suddenly had undeniable evidence of the region's critical ecological significance. But Sarah knew that media attention and public outrage, while helpful, wouldn't be enough to permanently protect the forest. Political and economic pressures would eventually override public sentiment unless the area could be given legal protection that couldn't be easily reversed. That's when Bobby made a suggestion that solved their problem in the most unexpected way possible. What if we let people see the Guardians? He asked during a strategy meeting. Not all of them, just enough to prove that this forest is home to species that science doesn't know about yet. If they can't deny that new discoveries are being made here, they'll have to treat it as a research preserve instead of a development site. The proposal was audacious and dangerous. Revealing the existence of their Guardian allies would expose them to scientific scrutiny, government investigation, and potential exploitation that could destroy everything they had worked to build. But their original Guardian surprised everyone by supporting Bobby's idea. Through his usual combination of drawings and gestures, he explained that his people had been hiding for centuries, watching their forest homes destroyed because humans didn't understand their value. Perhaps Perhaps it was time to trust humanity with knowledge that could change how they understood their relationship with the natural world. The revelation was managed with careful precision. Bobby arranged for selected wildlife photographers and documentary filmmakers to be in position when one of the younger guardians allowed himself to be briefly observed and filmed in his natural forest environment. The footage showed a being that was clearly intelligent, clearly non-human, and clearly demonstrating behaviors that indicated a sophisticated culture and deep connection to the, forest ecosystem. The scientific community's response was immediate and overwhelming. Anthropologists, primatologists, and conservation biologists descended on the region with equipment and funding for the most comprehensive wildlife research project in North American history. The development consortium's legal permits were suspended, pending completion of studies that could take decades to complete. More importantly, the federal government designated the entire region as a protected research area, with access limited to credentialed scientists and carefully managed ecological tourism that generated sustainable revenue for local communities without damaging the forest ecosystem. "We did it," Sarah said as she stood with her family on their original cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the protected forest in shades of gold and green. "We saved not just our home, but the entire ecosystem." Their guardian nodded, but his expression showed that he understood this victory as just one battle in a much longer war. Climate change, habitat fragmentation, and human population pressure would continue to threaten wilderness areas around the world. The network they had built was strong, but it would need to grow much larger to address the scope of environmental challenges facing the planet. "This is just the beginning," Sarah realized. "We've proven that this kind of protection is possible. Now we need to expand it everywhere." By 2010, the Guardian Network protected over 50 million acres of critical habitat worldwide. Their original forest sanctuary in the Olympic Peninsula had become the headquarters of an organization that rivaled traditional environmental groups in its influence and effectiveness, while operating with methods that were far more sophisticated and successful. Sarah, now 55 years old and recognized as one of the world's leading experts on ecosystem protection, often returned to the simple cabin where their transformation had begun. The building itself had been expanded and modernized to serve as a training center for new guardian families, but the essential character of the place remained unchanged. Standing beside Whispering Creek on a quiet morning, listening to the sounds of a forest that thrived under protection, Sarah sometimes marveled at the journey that had brought her family to this point. She had started as a desperate widow willing to risk everything for a $50 cabin in the wilderness. She had become the leader of a global movement that was reshaping how humanity understood its relationship with the natural world. Their original guardian, now ancient by human standards but still vital and wise, joined her by the creek for their morning ritual of planning and reflection. Though they no longer needed to communicate through drawings and gestures, Sarah had learned his people's spoken language years earlier. They still often worked in the comfortable silence that came from decades of shared purpose and mutual respect. "Do you think we've done enough?" Sarah asked, a question that had occupied her thoughts more frequently as she contemplated the scope of environmental challenges still facing the planet. Her guardian's response, delivered in the liquid syllables of his ancient tongue, translated roughly to, "We have planted seeds that will grow for generations. Each guardian family will train others. Each protected forest will serve as a refuge for wisdom that might otherwise be lost. We have given the Earth's children the tools they need to heal the damage and prevent greater harm." Sarah nodded, understanding that their work was part of a much larger pattern of healing and protection that would continue long after their own lives ended. They had broken the cycle of environmental destruction not through political action or legal challenges, but by training human beings to think like ecosystems and protect wilderness with the same instinctive devotion that parents show their children. As the sun climbed higher over their protected valley, Sarah heard the voices of the newest group of guardian apprentices beginning their morning training. Families from around the world had come to learn the skills that would allow them to establish and protect their own wilderness sanctuaries. The knowledge that had once been preserved by a single ancient guardian was now spreading across the globe, carried by humans who understood that environmental protection wasn't just a political cause, but a sacred responsibility that connected them to every living thing on the planet. 10 years had passed since Sarah Mitchell first walked into that real estate office in Cedar Falls, Washington, clutching her last $27 and hoping for a miracle. Now, standing on a ridge overlooking the Cascade Mountains in the autumn of 1997, she watched her children coordinate the most ambitious wilderness protection operation ever attempted in North America. Michael, now 22 years old, had become a master strategist whose understanding of forest ecosystems rivaled that of any academic ecologist. But, unlike university-trained scientists, Michael thought in terms of centuries rather than research grants. He could look at a threatened wilderness area and immediately see how to protect it not just for the next decade, but for the next 10 generations. Emma, 18 years old and possessing knowledge of plant medicine that would have amazed indigenous healers from centuries past, was leading a team of guardian apprentices in the restoration of damaged ecosystems throughout the Olympic Peninsula. Her ability to accelerate natural healing processes had allowed them to repair decades of environmental damage in a fraction of of the time anyone thought possible. Even Bobby, now 15, and serving as the primary liaison between guardian families and their animal intelligence networks, possessed abilities that bordered on the supernatural. He could coordinate wildlife behavior across hundreds of square miles, creating natural barriers and communication systems that made their protected territories virtually impregnable to unwanted intrusion. But perhaps most remarkable was the transformation of Sarah herself. The desperate widow who had once been willing to accept any shelter, no matter how dangerous, had become the acknowledged leader of a conservation network that protected over 3 million acres of pristine wilderness across 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. That their original guardian, now silver-haired but still powerful, watched the coordination meeting with obvious pride. Over the past decade, he had trained 43 human families in the deep wilderness wisdom of his people. Each family now protected and stewarded their own territory while contributing to the larger network of conservation efforts. The operation they were planning today would be their most challenging yet. A consortium of development companies, backed by international investment capital, was proposing the largest wilderness development project in Pacific Northwest history. They wanted to build a luxury resort complex that would destroy over 50,000 acres of old-growth forest and displace wildlife populations that had thrived in the region for millennia. Development had cleared all legal hurdles. Environmental impact studies had been manipulated or circumvented through political influence and regulatory capture. Traditional conservation organizations lacked the resources and legal standing to mount effective opposition. Within 6 months, bulldozers would begin clearing some of the most ecologically valuable forests remaining in North America. But the developers had no idea they were about to face opposition from protectors who thought and acted like forces of nature itself. The primary challenge, Michael explained to the assembled guardian families, is the scale of the operation. This isn't a single logging crew we can redirect or confuse. This is a coordinated development involving hundreds of vehicles, thousands of workers, and enough political backing to override most conventional opposition. Sarah studied the topographical maps spread across their planning table, each one marked with symbols indicating forest guardian positions, wildlife corridors, and critical ecosystem boundaries. The developers' plans would cut through the heart of a forest network that their guardian families had spent years establishing and protecting. "We can't use the same tactics that worked against smaller threats," she said. "This requires something unprecedented. We need to coordinate natural systems across multiple states simultaneously." Emma leaned over the maps, tracing watershed boundaries with her finger. "What if we use the forest itself to protest? Not just hiding or redirecting the development, but making the entire ecosystem actively resist the intrusion." Their original guardian nodded approvingly. Emma was thinking like her ancient predecessors, understanding that human purposes and natural systems could be aligned when guided by sufficient knowledge and wisdom. Over the following weeks, the Guardian Network implemented a strategy that was part environmental science, part guerrilla theater, and part something that most people would have called magic. They began by accelerating natural processes that would make the development sites ecologically unsuitable for construction. Sarah coordinated the overall strategy while Michael managed tactical implementation across the 7-state region. They triggered controlled avalanches that blocked access roads with what appeared to be natural seasonal events. They redirected water tables to create wetland conditions in areas that developers had planned to build upon. They encouraged accelerated plant growth that transformed construction sites into apparent wildlife habitats protected by environmental regulations. But most importantly, they coordinated the wildlife populations across the entire region to demonstrate the area's critical ecological significance in ways that even politically compromised environmental agencies couldn't ignore. Thousands of animals began migrating into the development zones, not in random patterns but in coordinated movements that created the largest wildlife concentration in recorded Pacific Northwest history. Endangered species that hadn't been seen in the region for decades suddenly appeared in numbers that suggested thriving but previously hidden populations. The spectacle attracted national media attention within days. Environmental photographers captured images of elk herds, bear families, and wolf packs coexisting peacefully in areas that the development consortium had claimed were ecologically barren. Bird species that were thought to be extinct in the region appeared in massive flocks that darkened the skies above the proposed construction sites. "It's like the forest is defending itself," reported a CNN correspondent who had come to cover what the media dubbed the Great Wildlife Gathering. "Every day brings new species, new populations that scientists didn't know existed in these mountains." The developer consortium found itself facing a public relations nightmare. Their environmental impact studies, which had dismissed the area as having minimal wildlife value, were revealed to be either fraudulent or incompetent. Environmental groups that had been powerless to stop the development through legal channels suddenly had undeniable evidence of the region's critical ecological significance. But Sarah knew that media attention and public outrage, while helpful, wouldn't be enough to permanently protect the forest. Political and economic pressures would eventually override public sentiment unless the area could be given legal protection that couldn't be easily reversed. That's when Bobby made the suggestion that solved their problem in the most unexpected way possible. "What if we let people see the Guardians?" he asked during a strategy meeting. "Not all of them, just enough to prove that this forest is home to species that science doesn't know about yet. If they can't deny that new discoveries are being made here, they'll have to treat it as a research preserve instead of a development site." The proposal was audacious, poisonous and dangerous. Revealing the existence of their guardian allies would expose them to scientific scrutiny, government investigation, and potential exploitation that could destroy everything they had worked to build. But their original guardian surprised everyone by supporting Bobby's idea. Through his usual combination of drawings and gestures, he explained that his people had been hiding for centuries, watching their forest homes destroyed because humans didn't understand their value. Perhaps it was time to trust humanity with knowledge that could change how they understood their relationship with the natural world. The revelation was managed with careful precision. Bobby arranged for selected wildlife photographers and documentary filmmakers to be in position when one of the younger guardians allowed himself to be briefly observed and filmed in his natural forest environment. The footage showed a being that was clearly intelligent, clearly non-human, and clearly demonstrating behaviors that indicated a sophisticated culture and deep connection to the forest ecosystem. The scientific community's response was immediate and overwhelming. Anthropologists, primatologists, and conservation biologists descended on the region with equipment and funding for the most comprehensive wildlife research project in North American history. The development consortium's legal permits were suspended, pending completion of studies that could take decades to complete. More importantly, the federal government designated the entire region as a protected research area, with access limited to credentialed scientists and carefully managed ecological tourism that generated sustainable revenue for local communities without damaging the forest ecosystem. "We did it," Sarah said as she stood with her family on their original cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the protected forest in shades of gold and green. "We saved not just our home, but the entire ecosystem." Their guardian nodded, but his expression showed that he understood this victory as just one battle in a much longer war. Climate change, habitat fragmentation, and human population pressure would continue to threaten wilderness areas around the world. The network they had built was strong, but it would need to grow much larger to address the scope of environmental challenges facing the planet. "This is just the beginning," Sarah realized. "We've proven that this kind of protection is possible. Now we need to expand it everywhere." Over the following years, the Guardian Network grew into a global movement that combined ancient ecological wisdom with modern conservation science. Guardian families established protected territories on every continent, working with indigenous communities, environmental organizations, and governments to create a new model of human-nature partnership. Sarah's children became leaders of this expanding movement, training new generations of guardians while advancing the scientific understanding of forest ecosystems and wildlife protection. Michael established the first university program in applied ecosystem guardianship, teaching traditional conservation biology alongside the deep ecological wisdom he had learned in the forests. Emma founded a global network of botanical preserves that protected rare plant species while advancing the development of natural medicines. Bobby became an international ambassador for wildlife protection, using his unique abilities to establish communication protocols between human communities and animal populations. But perhaps the important legacy of their work was the change it brought to human understanding of wilderness protection. The Guardian model demonstrated that environmental conservation wasn't just about preserving scenic areas for human enjoyment, but about maintaining the complex ecological relationships that sustained all life on the planet. By 2010, the Guardian Network protected over 50 million acres of critical habitat worldwide. Their original forest sanctuary in the Olympic Peninsula had become the headquarters of an organization that rivaled traditional environmental groups in its influence and effectiveness, while operating with methods that were far more sophisticated and successful. Sarah, now 55 years old and recognized as one of the world's leading experts on ecosystem protection, often returned to the simple cabin where their transformation had begun. The building itself had been expanded and modernized to serve as a training center for new Guardian families, but the essential character of the place remained unchanged. Standing beside Whispering Creek on a quiet morning, listening to the sounds of a forest that thrived under protection, Sarah sometimes marveled at the journey that had brought her family to this point. She had started as a desperate widow willing to risk everything for a $50 cabin in the wilderness. She had become the leader of a global movement that was reshaping how humanity understood its relationship with the natural world. Their original guardian, now ancient by human standards but still vital and wise, joined her by the creek for their morning ritual of planning and reflection. Though they no longer needed to communicate through drawings and gestures, Sarah had learned his people's spoken language years earlier. They still often worked in the comfortable silence that came from decades of shared purpose and mutual respect. "Do you think we've done enough?" Sarah asked, a question that had occupied her thoughts more frequently as she contemplated the scope of environmental challenges still facing the planet. Her guardian's response, delivered in the liquid syllables of his ancient tongue, translated roughly to, "We have planted seeds that will grow for generations. Each Guardian family will train others. Each protected forest will serve as a refuge for wisdom that might otherwise be lost. We have given the Earth's children the tools they need to heal the damage and prevent greater harm." Sarah nodded, understanding that their work was part of a much larger pattern of healing and protection that would continue long after their own lives ended. They had broken the cycle of environmental destruction, not through political action or legal challenges, but by training human beings to think like ecosystems and protect wilderness with the same instinctive devotion that parents show their children. As the sun climbed higher over their protected valley, Sarah heard the voices of the newest group of Guardian apprentices beginning their morning training. Families from around the world had come to learn the skills that would allow them them to establish and protect their own wilderness sanctuaries. The knowledge that had once been preserved by a single ancient guardian was now spreading across the globe, carried by humans who understood that environmental protection wasn't just a political cause, but a sacred responsibility that connected them to every living thing on the planet. That the widow who had bought a cabin for $50 had discovered something worth far more than money, a way of life that honored both human needs and the ancient wisdom of the wild. Places that sustained all life. Her children and their children would carry that knowledge forward, ensuring that future generations would inherit a world where wilderness and humanity could thrive together in the kind of partnership that the earth had always intended. In the end, Sarah Mitchell had found exactly what she had been looking for when she answered that classified ad in a small-town newspaper. She had found a home, not just a place to live, but a way of being in the world that connected her family to something larger and more enduring than any individual human life. The forest had taught them that true security didn't come from wealth or power, but from understanding their place in the living web of relationships that sustained all existence. And in teaching others to see the world through forest eyes, they had ensured that this wisdom would never again be lost to the human world.